Hello, everybody. This is Jennifer Matarese, and before I get started with the episode today, I'd just like to take care of the usual housekeeping. For starters, paid requests are now reopened. If you're interested in submitting a disaster request, please double-check the list of requests I most recently posted to the podcast's Facebook and Tumblr accounts to make sure your request has not already been made. Also, please look through past episodes to verify I haven't already covered the disaster in question. To submit a request, you can send a donation of $30 or more to the podcast PayPal at disasterarea@mail.com, on Venmo at Disaster Area Podcast, or on Cash App at Disaster Area Pod. Just add the name of the disaster to the notes on your donation. If you have an idea for an episode subject, but you're not sure if it qualifies, feel free to message me and I can approve one way or the other, although I usually do. The subject from this particular episode was chosen by Eric, and I'd like to thank them for the request and for the donation. If you'd still like to help support the podcast, you can do so with a one-time donation through PayPal, Venmo, or Cash App, or on a per-episode basis through Patreon at www.patreon.com/disasterareapodcast. A per-episode donation of even as little as $1 an episode can help me do things like pay the rent and keep the lights on. And if you do join the Patreon, you will get new episodes ad-free as soon as I record them, rather than waiting until they are released. So if you do become a patron, I would very much appreciate it. You can also follow the podcast on Facebook at Disaster Area Podcast, on Instagram at Disaster Area Pod, and on Tumblr at Disaster Area-Podcast. Also, please think about rating and reviewing the podcast on whatever app that you listen to podcasts on. And as always, the sources for each new episode can be found at disasterareapodcast.wordpress.com and in the episode description wherever you might be listening to me. The sources for this episode include the books Polio and American History by David M. Oshinsky and The Cutter Incident by Dr. Paul Offit, who also wrote a similarly named piece for the New England Journal of Medicine. Sources also include the Polio Crusade, an episode of The American Experience, and a video by OPENPediatrics on the iron lung. And before I proceed, I do want to issue a trigger warning for the mentions of the use of animals and aborted fetuses in medical experimentation. This does get somewhat graphic, so I will give a heads up when those descriptions are coming up. With all of that taken care of, thank you very much for listening, and welcome to Disaster Area. Episode 254. The Cutter Incident, April 1955. 10 deceased, 40,000 injured. Much like so many other Gen X kids, I caught chickenpox when I was about 4 or so. I didn't go to a chickenpox party where parents would all get their kids over to the same house as the kid who had chickenpox, so they could all just get it over with. I just picked it up like kids do with all sorts of bugs. The only thing I clearly remember about having chickenpox was scratching. I itched so much that to this day, being the least bit itchy drives me up a wall. My mom once joked that I shouldn't shave my head because I scratched so much back then I had a scab the size of her hand on the back of my head. I actually did shave my head a couple of years ago just for the hell of it, by the way. No scar that I could see, although I do not recommend doing that when you have to be outside in the summer. Sunburns on your head really hurt. Back then, chickenpox just seemed like a thing you should get when you were young because it was more of an irritation than it would be if you caught it later on. So now I have a scar on my hand and one on my forehead and a divot at the end of my right eyebrow and a higher chance of developing shingles that I'm going to need to take a vaccine for if I don't want the rashes and the prolonged pain. Yay! It would have been nice to get a chickenpox vaccine, but it didn't show up in the United States for general use until 1995, when I was a senior in high school, and both I and my brother had long since caught it and itched our way through it. The thing is, we were always given the impression that chickenpox was fine. An illness, sure, but one you just caught and rested your way through, eating chicken soup while you stayed home with your grandma and watched her soap operas. The truth is that according to the CDC, somewhere between 100 and 150 people would die each year in the United States from chickenpox prior to the vaccine, which is somewhat higher than the preferable amount of people to die from chickenpox, which is 0. This is why inoculations and vaccines were invented in the first place, because maybe, just maybe, no one should die of, say, measles in the year of our chocolate-dipped Lord 2025. There have always been people who have been distrustful of doctors or drugs or medical treatment in general. And in many cases, who could blame them? It took the international medical community until way too late in the grand scheme of things to realize that they should probably wash their hands between doing an autopsy and birthing a baby. You barely need to learn how to spell doctor before they would issue a medical degree in the US in the 1800s. And as the book Medical Apartheid expertly displays, medical advances in this country have often come at the expense of marginalized communities like Black people, women, and the disabled, who've been assaulted, tortured, maimed, and killed, all in the name of trying to take that extra step forward. We're actually going to mention a bit of using the disabled and the medically compromised as guinea pigs in this episode and the next episode, so there's your warning. That's not to say good medical advancements are always safe and tidy with no injuries or possible deaths as a result. People have bad reactions to medications they didn't know they were allergic to. People die under anesthesia before they even reach the operating room. Surgeons try their hardest and still fail. Medicine bumps up against good laws and bad laws, high costs, and the decisions of insurance company execs who might as well be high if they refuse to cover a double lung transplant because it just doesn't sound necessary. A double lung transplant. I still can't get over that one. Anyway, there are genuinely understandable reasons why someone might not trust doctors or medicines or vaccines. Maybe not correct reasons, but understandable ones. In the case of vaccines, one of the first advancements to test the trust of patients involved something which provided hope for fearful parents, only to terrify them with a horrifying mistake. Polio, or poliomyelitis, was also known as infantile paralysis, although it's not just children or infants who could catch the disease. For centuries, polio had popped up here or there in the historical record. An intestinal virus spread through the casual, everyday spread of fecal matter. And when I say that, that sounds gross and disgusting, but yeah, that's what happens. The fecal matter gets on all kinds of different things, and you may wash your hands, but it may come into contact with you in different ways. But yeah, polio has been around since the dawn of time. There is an image of an Egyptian, hieroglyph of a person who has a withered right leg, and it's more than likely polio. When you see a comparison of that to polio victims and what their limbs looked like following their disease, it looks a lot like that. Oh, for added disgust, by the way, just as a reminder, that fecal matter that I was mentioning, that enters your body through the mouth. Didn't wash your hands between walking from the outhouse to the kitchen table? Go swimming in the same lake people use to bathe? Share clothes with your sibling without washing them first? Congratulations, you've now been exposed to the polio virus. Don't worry, you weren't the first, and you certainly wouldn't be the last. In fact, Sir Walter Scott, the author of Ivanhoe and Rob Roy, suffered through a bout of polio as a toddler that left him with a withered leg. So, let's say you go out to play with your friends one hot and sunny July day. The best way to cool off is a good long swim, and the best place in town to go is the lake at the local park. So off you all go, diving in once you reach the pond without a care for what might be in the water. You goof around, you splash each other, you drink more questionable pond water than you probably should, and afterward you all head home to change back into regular clothes and eat dinner. Over the next few days, though, you don't feel so hot. At first it's just a headache, but soon it turns into some sort of stomach bug. You get to spend the day in bed, eating soup and taking naps. But at some point on a trip to the bathroom, one of your legs gives out under your weight. It aches as though you just ran a marathon. When your mom tries to massage the pain away, thinking it's just a cramp, you scream out in agony. Any touch to your leg is just a miserable amount of pain. You get taken to the hospital. Your legs become useless, then your arms. If you're lucky, it doesn't spread to the rest of your muscles like your diaphragm, impeding your ability to breathe. Inside your body, the virus, which entered your system through tainted pool water or an unwashed apple, is wreaking havoc on your nervous system. It finds the motor neurons, which control your muscle fibers, and crushes them, shutting down your muscles. The worst thing about polio is that the paralysis caused by the virus didn't just go away. Once it snuck into your body and took over the controls of your legs and arms, recovering the use of that body part could be a lost cause. It would require years of physical therapy for some people to even just be able to walk with braces or a cane, or just a short distance before they had to get back into a wheelchair. It was an effect that could very well, and usually was in these instances, permanent. One of the kids in my grade when I was growing up had to wear leg braces, but the ones that he wore in the 80s looked light and delicate compared to the stiff and ponderous scaffolding many polio victims in the early decades of the 1900s needed to wear in order to support themselves and their weakened bodies. Imagine Forrest Gump's childhood braces, then add a sturdy corset and maybe a set of crutches. Like, what he was wearing in that movie, it's pretty delicate compared to what a lot of people who had polio went through. So, I mean, of course, he's got to run in one scene and they fall away, so I'm sure that has to be part of it. But also, the things that polio victims had to wear to offset the paralysis that they went through, it could be a lot. Of course, the worst case scenario, other than death, wasn't leg braces or a paralyzed arm muscle for the rest of your life. It was however long you could stay alive inside an iron lung. The iron lung was a last resort, invented by Harvard researcher Philip Drinker and Louis Shaw in 1928 to treat a girl with polio. When your diaphragm and chest muscles were paralyzed by polio, you would be placed in this horizontal cylinder in which the changing pressure would work your chest and lungs for you. The goal was for those put in an iron lung to eventually leave it, although that didn't always occur. You were usually supposed to spend not a lot of time in there. It was just a last resort. You could be able to leave, for short periods of time. But in some cases, people spent years, if not decades, in them. Some people ended up having to spend the rest of their lives in one, lying on their back and looking at the world from a mirror angled above their heads. There's a man named Paul Alexander who died a few years ago, who was 76, I believe, and he had passed away after spending decades in an iron lung. As I recall, he was in there from the time he was about 8, so that is a long time to be in an iron lung, but he didn't really have a choice about being in there or not. Much like so many machines keeping people alive today, if the power went out, so too did the iron lung. This meant that the hand lever on the iron lung would need to be pumped continuously until it returned a power to the machine. Now, when I say hand lever, you're picturing something small. No. If you were in an iron lung and you were lucky, a line of people would be there to pump the hand lever for however long it would take. It was this long bar at the end of the iron lung with a handle at the top and a footrest at the bottom. I mean, it's probably about 3 feet long. And you've got the handle up on top where you put your hand, and then the foot at the bottom. And you're using this to move the compression, like the suction thing at the end of the iron lung, which is this big iron tube. You're pressing this back and forth to move that in and out. And that pressure helps this person breathe, but it's very tiresome. If you see somebody doing it, it looks like something out of a gym, like something that you would exercise on. It looks like half of I can't remember the name of it right now. Like a ski machine. It looks like half of that. It's a lot. It is so much. And to do that for a long period of time, that is not ideal. This is just not a realistic situation for a lot of people to live in long term, even with the power. Iron lungs were big, they were loud, they were clunky, not meant to be movable. There is a video that I mentioned earlier that I used as a source from OPENPediatrics about the iron lung, and they actually put somebody in an iron lung and turn it on so you can see how it works. And it is relatively, considering some of the things that go on in hospitals, it's relatively loud. It is not hugely loud, but you have to imagine that somebody in an iron lung like this is in a room full of people with iron lungs, and they're all making this noise. So it's probably a very loud thing to be in a room full of people in iron lungs hearing this sound, this motor making that suction go on and work continuously. Staying in an iron lung was also costly. And for what? Patients might be able to leave for short stints, but in many cases you were stuck there with the machine forcing your lungs to continue working, learning how to eat while lying on your back in between breaths. You had to learn how to breathe. You had to learn how to talk. You had to learn how to eat. You could only talk when you were exhaling. It was a lot. It was a lot. It was costly, not exactly a choice one could make for a family member if your family was barely scraping by. In the Polio Crusade, one clip shows a boy being examined by several doctors and nurses. The boy is maybe 14 or so, given his height. His shirtless chest and bare arms are almost skin and bones. If there is any muscle beneath the skin, there isn't much. When he is turned to face the woman touching him, you can see his spine is curved or hunched. He looks as though he might have scoliosis. It may just be the way that he's standing, but it looks really uncomfortable. The boy appears to be of black descent. Now, this is important for a reason. The boy is, in at least two aspects, the picture of the usual polio victim, at least as far as most people saw it. Boys got it, usually, but not always. Kids got it, usually, but not always. But black people weren't thought to get it as much as white people or blonde people, or however scientists justified to themselves that it meant that they didn't have to study its impact on black communities. In fact, the first polio poster child would be a little white boy named Donald Anderson, sad and sickly in his hospital crib as a 3-year-old in one corner of the poster, striding confidently toward the viewer as a 6-year-old in the other corner. That was the kid parents would come to fear for as the worst of polio in the United States would rise in the late 40s and early 50s. Summers were always a difficult time to avoid the possibility of contracting polio. In so many places, the best way to beat the heat was to visit the town pool or the lake at the park or the local swimming hole. Kids freed from the classroom for the summer months flocked to places where they could swim for an hour or two and cool off. You'd think at the beginning of the 20th century, when people were moving toward being more cleanly, washing up more often, etc., that polio would decrease. After all, cleanliness fights off plenty of diseases, and that was the case for a lot of things in regards to the early 20th century, late 19th century. People were being more cleanly. They're doing more to make sure that there was not so much sewage and dirt and all kinds of different things like, dead horses in the street, in the cities, things like that. There were just a lot of things that were perpetuating disease in communities like this and in areas like this because cleanliness was not so much of a thing. And then when they started to make an effort to get people to do more of this, to do more to take care of their environment and themselves, it fought off a lot of diseases. In a few years, over the course of those years, the number of people who died from preventable diseases, that went down, and the causes of death in a lot of people were more like accidents, heart disease, cancer, those sorts of things, which are, completely different from when it's typhoid and polio and other things like that. But cases of polio oddly increased. It turned out that when you improved sanitation, you lessened the chances smaller children would be exposed to the polio virus and develop the same sort of immunity they would for chickenpox. Instead of being exposed as infants when they were being taken, they were taking in their mother's antibodies to polio through breast milk. Now they were facing it down as older kids with their mother's antibodies, a distant memory in their immune systems. So in the early decades of the 1900s, polio outbreaks sprouted up like patches of dandelion weeds. It was a good thing for every other disease. For this particular disease, though, it was bad. It had a negative effect in terms of preventing people from getting it, which is just that it just sprouted up all over the place. So before it starts to feel like this episode only focuses on polio's effects on the United States and other developed nations during the 20th century, that's because that's where it was hitting the hardest during those decades. Places like the United States, Canada, Australia, Western Europe, they were all getting hit by outbreaks here and there over those first decades of the century. It popped up in other places, of course, but with those improvements in general hygiene impacting natural immunity, the United States was one of the countries which saw cases of polio rising. In 1894, the Otter Valley in Vermont hosted the first recorded polio epidemic in the country. The timing of polio's emergence as an epidemic in the United States, popping up here and there after that first showing in Vermont, lined up with a growing change in the way the country trained up its doctors. Barely trained up its doctors. See, for a good long while there, you could get all the way to a medical degree without ever seeing a patient at all. You'd attend a certain number of lectures, take a test or two, depending on the medical school and whether or not it was just a diploma mill, which a lot of them were, and that would be the extent of the education you would need. If you wanted a real education in medical research, you'd pack your bags and head to Europe, which a lot of doctors did. They all went to Europe to learn medical research and medical treatment and things like that, because you weren't going to get that here. But the first polio epidemics arrived not long before the opening of the Rockefeller Institute in New York City in 1902, and other centers for real scientific research would be available soon enough. A lot of the extraordinarily rich people back then were doing things like funding medical centers and museums and libraries and all sorts of things which would improve the general good. So things change. If you have a place to research, you need something to research. Polio became one of multiple diseases researchers could address in an attempt to search for a possible cause, vaccine, and cure. Until then, it would be one outbreak after another throughout the country, like in New York City in 1916 among Italian immigrant families. Kids were struck down in the hundreds and thousands, just due to the fact that so many people were crammed into the same area. That's just going to happen. It's not a matter of the choices that they make. It's not a matter of this. It's just there's a lot of people in one place, so there's a lot of people who are going to get it. Tenement-dwelling immigrant families didn't have the right living situation to properly quarantine their kids. You can't just keep the kids in the house and, keep them in bed, let them, go to the bathroom in the apartment. Like, that's not how this works. These are the same kids who lived in homes where the houses didn't have indoor plumbing. You had to go outside and go to an outhouse. So, yeah, there's that to deal with. Like, you're sharing a bathroom with everybody in the apartment building. That's an issue. So the disease would bounce around the area like a tiger on caffeine. Like, that is just the way that it works. A lot of people tried the sort of home remedies to fight off polio that they'd try in a couple of years to ward off the 1918 flu. Smelly household items crammed into pouches hung around their necks like camphor and onions and things like that. Everything from blackberry brandy and earthworm oil to horse blood taken as a remedy a friend of a friend of a friend passed along. People were basically downing anything. And luckily we have never tried to use whatever random thing your friend told you would cure a disease ever again. People blamed everything short of the kitchen sink with giving their kids polio, although the kitchen sink probably helped in giving them polio in some ways. Anyway, out of all of the polio victims in New York City that summer of 1916, 27% of them did not survive. 2,400 deceased, most of them children. But those pop-up polio epidemics were rarely anything too huge. Like, they were important, but they were also not, like, enormous, terrible things. I mean, we have experience with at least one worldwide epidemic in our lifetimes with COVID in the past 5 years. You look at other things as well, like, AIDS and HIV, swine flu, things like that. It's a lot. And polio was much smaller in terms of the epidemics that would pop up. It wasn't something where it would pop up and everybody in the area would pass it on along like Captain Trips in the Stand. It wasn't like that. It would never reach the thoroughness of the 1918 flu or COVID. A town or neighborhood would find itself the target of polio infections over the summer, a couple of hundred patients maybe, mostly kids, with maybe a handful of them passing away. It would become a problem at the beginning of summer, then fade away at the crisp chill of fall in the air. But what kind of monster is okay with the death of kids, as long as the death toll is low? Like, if somebody is saying, like, it only killed a few kids, well, no, that's still bad. Dead kids are still bad. There is a scene in the movie And the Band Played On, which if you've never seen it, it's a wonderful movie. It was made for HBO in the 90s. And there is a scene where the people from the CDC are speaking with people from the Red Cross and other organizations and other groups that needed to deal with the not knowing what was going on in regards to HIV and AIDS and that sort of thing and how it was being passed around. And so they're all meeting together, and one of the characters is getting really, really frustrated because groups like the Red Cross representative and people like that are saying, well, we would have to change all of our blood testing and all of this, and why should we have to do that for a few dead hemophiliacs? And one of the characters gets really frustrated, one of the doctors who works for the CDC, and he says, how many dead hemophiliacs do you need? Why don't you give us a number and we'll come back to you when saving people is more important to you than money. Like, that is his response. And it's really frustrating because you're in the same boat that he is. He's the audience representative, but it really represents a lot of the way that we treat disease and that we respond to public health crises, is that sometimes it can be really frustrating because there's people who say, well, it's okay if certain people, it only affects certain people. How many of those people do you want dead? How many of those people are you okay with? Give us a number. We want to know. So that was the same thing with polio. A lot of people were seriously worried about this, but they were more worried, I think, in comparison to other diseases for certain reasons. There was a lot of scare tactics, which I will talk about in a little bit. I'm going to give Professor a moment to calm down. I'm sure there's something outside that he is really interested in, but anyway. Polio, up until a certain point, had been an issue, obviously, and they were trying to fight it, but then it made a mistake. It made a very big mistake. In 1921, it did something that, if it were a person, would be seen as the beginning of the end of its career. It infected a rich white guy everybody knew. That summer, 39-year-old rising politician and former Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, traveled to his summer home on Campobello Island off of eastern Maine with his family. They'd actually arrived earlier, but he shows up in early August. He gets there on August 7th, and just immediately he starts getting into the summer frame of mind. He starts swimming and boating and running with his kids and just having a good time. He's drinking with the family, although I think this is prohibition, but you could still drink as long as you had alcohol that was you bought beforehand. And of course, all of these rich families had wine cellars. Anyway, he's having a blast with his family. He's out playing with the kids. He's having a good time. It's been a very stressful year. He ran for Democratic vice president the year before, and he hadn't won. So yeah, it's been a bad year all around. He's dealing with a scandal with the Navy, which if you have ever listened to The Dollop, you remember the Newport scandal, I believe it's called. Yeah, he was dealing with that. Anyway, he's having a bad time. So he goes to Campobello Island with his family. He's having a great time. On August 8th, which is basically, I think it was the second day he was there, he's spending part of the day swimming. He goes to help some people put out a fire on another island. He is doing a bunch of things around. He's playing with his kids, like I said. And he spends part of the day in his wet bathing suit. He starts feeling a little tired as the day is going on. Towards the end of the day, he's starting to feel tired. So he's, you know what? I'm going to go to bed. As he starts feeling weird, it's described in Polio and American History as, quote, a mixture of numbness, deep muscle ache, and frightening chills, all of which sound similar to the way I felt both times that I caught COVID. I was sore from head to toe for 2 weeks straight both times. I felt like I'd run a marathon, and I went to sleep to try and rest, and I would wake up and I would still feel that way. It was awful. I would not recommend it to anyone. Now, I got better, but Roosevelt woke up the next day feeling even worse, and his left leg was numb. It wouldn't take his weight. It would take visits from 2 other doctors before a third finally came up with a diagnosis of polio. Like, the first doctor showed up and was just like, just rest. It's probably some intestinal thing. You're fine. The second doctor shows up and is like, oh, it's a blood clot. It traveled to your spine. $600, please. It's like, okay, you know what? And then the third doctor shows up, and this doctor had written a book on polio. And so he goes, well, that's polio. And so there are some arguments now about whether or not he actually had polio, given the way that, the things that I have read. I do believe he had polio. Either way, whether he had it or not, this was a bad move for him to think he had polio or for him to actually have polio. Either way, it was a bad news for polio thing. But as it was, by the time he gets diagnosed, he is paralyzed from the waist down. He starts getting these recommended massages of his the limbs that aren't moving by the doctor that came to see him. I think it was second or first. One of the earlier doctors had said, well, massage his legs and that'll feel better. But Eleanor Roosevelt, his wife, goes in and starts massaging his legs, and he is just in agony. This hurts like so much. And it turns out those massages might have actually made things worse. So that's not good. Now, he had been a healthy guy up to this point, a relatively healthy guy, but at the same time, he had also been really sheltered for the beginning of his life when he was a little kid. He's a rich kid. He's living in this fancy house. He's not going to school. He's getting tutored, all of that. So it doesn't make for a lot of good when you're not getting exposed to the sort of bugs that a lot of kids get. Chickenpox being a prime example. So by the time that he was old enough to go to a boarding school and that sort of thing, he started, in the words of Dolly Parton in Steel Magnolias, picking up everything but boys and money. He would get every disease he ran across because he was just getting everything because he'd never gotten exposed to stuff. And so that was an issue that he had his whole life, where he just would get sick from all kinds of things. He got, when the 1918 flu was going around, he was getting that as well. Professor's also barking at something else. So, he just got a lot of things. So the fact that he picked up polio from taking a dip in the Bay of Fundy after a stressful, overworked year was pretty typical with his track record. Again, people argue whether or not he may have been misdiagnosed, but whether or not infecting him would lead to a vaccine against that same disease decades later, and kind of was the death knell of polio. It just infected the wrong rich white guy. It was a guy who was willing to work to make sure that it was fought against, and also a guy that everybody liked. Roosevelt was willing to do whatever was necessary, or arguably not that necessary, to try and restore the use of his legs. Several years after his diagnosis, Roosevelt received a letter from the guy who owned Warm Springs, a resort in Georgia with Warm Springs, which had supposedly helped another young man with polio get his legs working again. Warm Springs turned into Roosevelt's obsession, and the vessel through which he directed his efforts to help other victims of polio. In a photo taken at Warm Springs, Roosevelt smiles for the camera in a bucket hat and a swimsuit that looks more like a tank top and just loose shorts. There's a clear difference between the appearance of his arms and his legs as he sits beside a pool with his right elbow resting on his right knee and his left arm propping him up. His arms, while not defined, are muscular and used to lifting the weight of his own body. His legs, on the other hand, aren't withered away to atrophy, but they are slim enough to pass for those of a teenage boy. They're very slim. They're not, like I said, not atrophied completely. It's not just skin and bones there, but there's really not a lot to them compared to his arms. There's a clear difference between the two, and you can tell which is being worked on a regular basis and which are affected by polio. Warm Springs didn't cure Roosevelt's paralysis. Nothing would do that for him or anybody else. That was not what that was meant for. It was supposed to relieve the effects of polio, but that was arguable. The only thing he could do for himself was make use of the adaptive tools available for polio victims to assist them in getting things done. He was rich, he could afford those tools and those modifications to items he used on a regular basis. Ramps, canes, wheelchairs, braces, but plenty of other polio victims couldn't, and Roosevelt knew that. He snapped up Warm Springs with the intention of providing that resource to other victims who needed that sort of therapy. The thing is, and this is something that a lot of people, I think, get confused by, it's not that people didn't know that Roosevelt had polio. You don't get to be that firmly in the public eye your entire life without such news getting out. And it did almost immediately upon his initial infection. The year before his infection, like I said, he'd been the Democratic nominee for vice president. When he caught polio, it was a headline on the front page of the New York Times. Now he became the most famous person anyone knew who had polio. But people didn't know just how bad Roosevelt's paralysis was. Roosevelt politely asked reporters not to take photos of him in a wheelchair or being carried at times, or whenever else it was clear his paralysis was not just simply a limp. Somewhat astonishingly, the reporters obliged him. He would say, "Not now, boys," and they would just go, "Okay," and they would just let him get wheeled away or struggle to get into a chair or out of a chair. He would ask and they would just do it. And that's why there's not a lot of photos of him doing these sorts of things, because he just asked and they said, "Okay." Well, pictures were taken of him in private with his legs bare or sitting in a wheelchair or those sorts of things. One could hardly guess he needed more than a cane, given the way that he was portrayed in public. Pictures didn't show these sorts of things. Political cartoons didn't show these sorts of things. They didn't nitpick on him when they criticized him for things. And he was criticized. Every president gets criticized no matter what they do. But no matter how people criticized him, they didn't point at him and say, "Oh, also, look at him, he can't walk." That wasn't something. It wasn't the ability that he had to walk that would be criticized. It was whether or not, what he actually did, which is part of the reason that he was kind of keeping the ability to walk and, how difficult he found that, kind of under wraps so that it wouldn't become an issue. But everybody knew he had polio. That was not a secret. Meanwhile, the sleight of hand needed to play down his paralysis went to the sort of assistive lengths many disabled people, both back then and today, could only wish others were willing to support. Ramps and wheelchairs, canes and leg braces, like I said, railings on podiums so Roosevelt could hold himself up while giving speeches, iron supports he could lock his leg braces to when standing at the rear of his train car, speaking to a crowd. Sometimes a conspiracy to hide a president's medical condition can work, like when Grover Cleveland had surgery on a yacht to remove a tumor from the roof of his mouth. John F. Kennedy Jr. also had like several things wrong with him that weren't known to the public. A lot of presidents have had medical issues that they don't share with the public for obvious reasons given recent news. Let's put it that way. But with something like paralysis caused by polio, the number of people involved in carrying off such a plan increases the chances someone will spill the beans. Conspiracy theories and conspiracies, I should say, always, the ones that work are the ones where there aren't a lot of people talking about them. When you start to make a conspiracy too big, it probably isn't real, because after a certain amount of people, somebody's going to talk. People cannot keep a secret. What's that saying? Two people can keep a secret if one of them is dead. It's that kind of a thing. Once you start adding people to your conspiracy and make it too big, it's not going to work. Roosevelt wanted to focus on the fight against polio and keeping Warm Springs as a place which supported polio victims, but politics beckoned. New York needed a governor, and the Democrats wanted him in the seat. He ran, and he won. So while he occupied himself with the matter of running the state of New York, he put his partner in his law firm, Basil O'Connor, in charge of the Georgia Warm Springs Foundation. O'Connor's response was less like, yay, I get to help people who need help, and more like, hey, whatever helps your career, buddy. This was not Basil O'Connor being warm and helpful and wanting to do all of this. He was basically helping his friend. That was why he started doing this in the first place. Running the foundation was hard enough, and then October of 1929 comes along. The stock market collapsed that month like a wet gingerbread house. It had been going down for a little bit. If you know anything about the stock market crash, it wasn't something that happened just in one day like that. It was something that happened like it was going down, and then it just plummeted. The donations to the Warm Spring Foundation, much like with every other charity out there, plummeted along with the Dow Jones. Usually what you were going for as a charity were the big money checks from rich donors that would help keep your organization afloat. That is what had been keeping the Warm Springs Foundation going for a while. Is you'd have these parties and these big fundraisers, and you'd get money from rich people. But once the Great Depression kicked off, nobody had anything to give to charity, not the rich nor the poor. Rich people were trying to, you're trying to maintain, you're trying to keep things going, but at the same time, these were people who, a lot of them had lost a lot, and so they couldn't give like $5,000, $6,000, $10,000, however it was that they normally gave to charity, or they weren't willing to. They were too busy taking care of themselves and their families and that sort of thing. Professor's going to bark out the window again. The stock market crash inadvertently helped the fight against polio, one could argue. Republican Herbert Hoover was president at the time the stock market took its infamous tumble, and to say people were livid would be an understatement. It's bad as a president when they're naming the shanty towns which rise up to house those who lost their homes during their presidency after you. Needless to say, if something like the Great Depression happens under your watch, people aren't going to be racing to the polls to vote for you the next chance they get. This meant that when the next presidential election rolled around in 1932, people tripped over themselves to get to the voting booths and check off the box beside Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt won with 472 out of 531 electoral votes, with Herbert Hoover only winning 59 electoral votes. They were all in New England, and more than half of them, came from Pennsylvania, for which I can only retroactively apologize. Being president put Roosevelt, or more aptly, Basil O'Connor, in a perfect position to raise money for polio victims. O'Connor could use the weight of the president's name to entice donors to give what they could. Large donations from rich people prior to the Great Depression, small donations from many more not-so-rich people after. Unsurprisingly, the smaller donations worked out better. The first big fundraisers for the fight against polio after Roosevelt became president were the balls held on his birthday each year, which raised $2.3 million the first 3 years that they were held. These were like these huge balls, and even small balls that would be held, I keep saying that, it just sounds so bad, these big parties that would be held in like towns across the country. Cities across the country were having these parties, and all of them were meant to raise money for polio and for the Warm Springs Foundation, and it worked. Then came the idea, which would raise incredible amounts of money to fight polio at a time when so many people had so little. See, what you do is you get a bunch of celebrities, Eddie Cantor, Judy Garland, Mickey Rooney, and you put them on the radio and in newsreels and in film shorts, and you have them ask, hey, can you spare a dime for these poor, sick kids and send it to the White House to FDR, our favorite president who we love very much? It really did sound like that. One dime from one president isn't much. One dime from one person isn't much, but a dime here or there from millions of people given repeatedly over time adds up. Mail bags piled up throughout the White House filled with envelopes containing however many dimes the sender could spare. Almost $2 million in dimes were dumped out of envelopes onto tables in the White House. That was the start of the March of Dimes, more formally known as the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, and it is part of the reason why Roosevelt remains on the United States dime to this day after being added to it in 1946. Of course, the thing to keep in mind with all of this is that polio, while increasing in its prevalence among the general population, was not actually as common as some might think, given the public relation efforts of Roosevelt and Basil O'Connor. Not a lot of people got it. Not a lot of those people ended up in hospital with it. Not a lot of those people had permanent paralysis because of it, and only a tiny amount of those people died from it. But there was always that little bit of fear. What if my kid ends up being in that tiny group of fatal victims of the disease? That was always around for those first decades of the 20th century in the United States. It was this huge thing. What if my kid gets polio? You were terrified of it. The warnings which would go out to fend off polio were going to sound awfully familiar to all of us nearly 6 years after COVID first emerged. Make sure to wash your hands. Don't hang out in large groups. Rest well. Don't join your friends for a swim. Theaters and restaurants shut down. People would blame poor communities, black communities, the immigrant communities, and yet it always seemed to show up in flourishing small towns and suburbs. In April of 1945, Franklin Delano Roosevelt died of cerebral hemorrhage at the age of 63, leaving behind not just a country still at war at the time, but a foundation which had propped itself up on his name pretty much since its inception. Roosevelt was popular, and it had always been a big help to fundraising to point in the direction of the president and say, FDR sent me. But with the war soon over and Roosevelt dead, the March of Dimes needed to shift gears to find the right way of getting people to donate. So Basil O'Connor went with a tried and true method of influencing the public. Scare the pants off them. Polio soon popped up in newsreels and film shorts as the scary monster in the dark, the spooky shadow swallowing up America's kids and dropping what was left of them in the dust. Like there's literally a short film from the time where you see polio as this dark shadow that goes around and snatches people up and leaves them behind sick or takes them away. It's just, it looks like a horror movie. It is, in retrospect, a little hilarious the way that the film is playing with people's mindsets. Yeah, isn't it though, Professor? It's just kind of hilarious the way people are sort of influenced by this sort of thing to do exactly what Basil O'Connor wanted them to do, which is give him money. Now, how good of a parent were you if you couldn't keep your kid from getting polio? Get your kids to wash their hands before eating, check their temperature and their muscle strength, and above all else, donate. Like, parents were checking their kids every morning, like turning their heads to the side, checking their arms to make sure they stayed up, making them walk across the kitchen back and forth to make sure there's no muscle weakness. Like, it was a lot. In the summers, polio would appear in towns like Wytheville, Virginia, in which around 5,500 people resided. In 1950, polio sprung up among the population there, sending dozens of people to bed, or in the worst cases, to the Wytheville Clinic. Cafes and cinemas closed for the time being to prevent polio spreading any more than it already was, and it was spreading quite well even without those open businesses and schools closed for the summer. They actually had signs outside of town which were like, we love you in Wytheville, just maybe don't come this summer, come next summer to enjoy the summer with us. It was that kind of a thing. In Wytheville, the town's 2 ambulances circled in and out of the clinic, one coming and one going, both carrying possible polio victims, the one leaving, heading to bigger cities like Richmond with more equipped hospitals. The local newspaper, the Southwest Virginia Enterprise, had a sign posted outside where it constantly updated just how many cases of polio the town had. In the American Experience, the Enterprise's board, undated except to note the last update on Saturday at 11:35 a.m., notes 87 total cases of polio, with 56 from Wytheville and 31 from the county, 23 having returned home, 54 hospitalized, 7 reported that day, and 10 having died. By Tuesday, the board showed 100 reported cases. By Wednesday, 109 cases with the deaths at 11. By the end of the summer, it would be 17, I believe. Towns like Wytheville would do whatever was necessary to try to stop the spread of polio, including spraying down the town with DDT. For those of you young enough not to cringe at that particular name, DDT was a pesticide which was useful for killing mosquitoes, good, and plenty of other animals which also happened to be around, bad. In the decades since, it's been restricted due to its negative impacts on the environment, which makes all of that film of people spraying it in thick clouds over yards and playgrounds more than a little unsettling. The solution of the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, the March of Dimes, was the one that usually works for these sorts of problems. Throw money at it from every angle until it's almost drowning in it. Its plea for dimes turned into a continual funding drive, which changed over time as the United States went through a Great Depression and a Second World War, and all of the things that were involved in that. Ushers would come down the aisles in movie theaters after newsreels about the March of Dimes with donation canisters, just little canisters with little, slots in the top, and they'd go around and people would toss in a dime or two or coins or whatever they had available. Women would organize donation drives where one evening each year, homes in the neighborhood could turn on their porch light to announce volunteers walking through the area would come and take the homeowners' donations. And the whole time, Basil O'Connor is playing into what he needed to play into to get people to continue donating. Obviously, when you're talking about wartime or during a depression, money's tight and you need to justify why people are going to donate to you. So, for example, with the war, the persuasion as to why you would donate for polio was we need to keep our troops healthy, and to do that, we need to make sure they survive childhood without catching polio. And so that was how they managed to persuade people, hey, we need to keep our kids safe. Basil O'Connor and the foundation would take those armfuls of coins, turn around and use them to pay everything it took to get polio victims back on their feet. No pun intended. They paid for hospital bills, for doctors and nurses and physical therapists, for the training for those medical professionals, for equipment and testing and research, and even more fundraising. One of the most important items on their agenda, however, was the discovery of a vaccine. O'Connor was laser focused on getting that polio vaccine. That was all he wanted for Christmas, was that. Again, he threw money at the problem. It didn't work. He declared they'd be finding a vaccine any day now to the public. He came out and said, oh, we're going to get one any day now. I think it was in 47 or 48. He said that. He was like, oh yeah, we're just going to get one any day now. Didn't work. Didn't conjure one up out of the blue. Basil O'Connor wanted a polio vaccine yesterday, which, as far as most scientists would say, was next to impossible. Albert Sabin, a leading expert in vaccine development, would argue with O'Connor about delivering a polio vaccine when it was complete and not 1 second sooner. O'Connor would argue with him that they needed a vaccine good and fast because kids were dying every summer. They let a vaccine slip through their fingers. They both had a good point, but also clearly this relationship was teetering around a breakup. The two of them would have these arguments about getting a vaccine and when they were going to get a vaccine and all of this. And Albert Sabin, in some cases, he's kind of portrayed as somebody who's just being contentious to be contentious, but you get the impression with all of this that they all have good points. They're just, and they all have their flaws, everybody involved in this, but also, there's a lot of little grumbling and catfights going on. It would almost be amusing if it wasn't over a vaccine to save people from dying. Then, like the female protagonist in a Tyler Perry movie, O'Connor ran into a guy who told him exactly what he wanted to hear while on a business trip shipboard on the Queen Mary. Sure, I can get you a polio vaccine. You want me to get it for you in 6 months? A year? Say the word and I'm yours. Now, granted, he probably didn't say all that to Basil O'Connor in that tone of voice. But the more O'Connor spoke with University of Pittsburgh medical researcher Jonas Salk while on the ship back to Europe, the more he liked what he heard. Here's the thing about Jonas Salk. He was what a lot of researchers into vaccines were at the time, which is very ambitious. you have to kind of be to think that you can make a vaccine which is going to save everybody. It's kind of like the thing where if you want to run for president, you kind of have to be a little bit of a narcissist, because if you think you can solve everybody's problem, you have to be like that. So you kind of have to be a little bit like that to be the sort of person who's looking into this sort of thing, because you think that you can make a vaccine that does this. You have to have great ambition to get to this point. You have to be smart, you have to be educated, you have to be experienced and knowledgeable and all of that, and you have to also be willing to go the extra mile to do something like this. Okay, here we go. Here's the part where I warn you that I am about to talk about experimentation on animals and aborted fetuses, and understandably, it's not pretty. So maybe don't eat for a few minutes. Monkeys were a key part of polio research since the early 20th century. They were expensive, each of them costing nearly $250 in today's money in those early years, but they caught the polio virus easily enough. You just had to introduce the virus to the monkey system, the best way being directly into the nervous system, usually right into the spinal cord. Humans are the only animals that can naturally get polio. So when they needed to put them in animals that they were testing, it would need to be given to them, like injected into them, or when they were testing how it moved from one creature to another, one being to another, then they tried swabbing their noses with it, they tried their mouths, like they were trying all of these different ways to figure out how it went from one person to another. And with the monkeys, what they were doing is putting it right into their spinal cord, just injecting it right in there. Karl Landsteiner, the Austrian scientist who would later win the Nobel Prize for discovering blood typing and making successful blood transfusion possible, isolated the polio virus along with Erwin Popper in 1908. After grinding up the spinal cord of a young boy who'd lost his life to polio, Landsteiner injected what he had left into a pair of monkeys, both of whom developed polio. Scientists would later test transmission possibilities on monkeys using various bodily fluids from polio victims, figuring out that it spread from fecal particles through the mouth. So, hey, if you think your job is terrible, at least you're not going to work every day and giving monkeys polio. Meanwhile, over at the Rockefeller Institute, director Simon Flexner had managed to isolate polio antibodies, again using monkeys and more ground up spinal cords full of polio. This led to the later reasoning that polio antibodies in the blood could protect people from polio, given as the virus needed to travel in the blood to get to the central nervous system. And since polio was like chickenpox, once you've had it, you're unlikely to get it again, a vaccine was a possibility. Now, when it came to a polio vaccine, it wasn't as if it hadn't been tried prior to the late 1940s. John Colmer attempted to make a polio vaccine in 1932 by taking the monkey spinal cords he ground up, filtering them through mesh, and treating them for 15 days in a solution of ricinoleate. Looks a little more complicated than it is. If the first part of that word sounds familiar, ricinoleate, it's because it originates in the castor bean plant, just like ricin, the toxin used in terror attacks like the letters sent to multiple Democratic and progressive groups and politicians in 2013. It would turn out that Colmer didn't use a control group of children who didn't get the vaccine to compare results against, which is kind of a necessity for this sort of thing. You need a control group. You do. His vaccine also gave a bunch of kids in the testing group polio, the literal opposite of what he was going for. In fact, 5 of them died, and a bunch developed paralysis in the arm which had gotten the shot. Which is going to sound familiar later on. When Colmer had to defend his vaccine in front of a group of medical researchers, he claimed it was just a complete coincidence that the only kids in 2 different cities that he vaccinated ended up getting polio, and in 2 cases, dying. It wasn't his vaccine. It was, just some of the disease from which his vaccine was meant to protect those kids sneaking in past its defense. It's fine. Just reading that, by the way, reminded me of the time I found out that Vicodin makes me sick. I went to work. I had a toothache. It was horrible. My entire side of my face was on fire, and a coworker said, well, how about if I give you half of a Vicodin and it should be able to kill your pain? And I said, that's great. I'll try that. So I took half a Vicodin, and then I spent the next 4 hours in the bathroom throwing up. I realized, okay, Vicodin is bad for me. So I just kind of managed to hold on for the rest of the night, went home, slept it off. And then about a month later, I still hadn't taken care of my tooth, I know. And again, horrible tooth pain, right side of my face in agony. And my coworker again says, "You want a Vicodin?" And I said, no, the last time it made me sick. And she goes, no, it's fine. It was just a coincidence. You just got a stomach flu and the timing was off, but you should take another one. I said, okay, fine. So she gave me half of a Vicodin, and then I spent the next 4 hours throwing up. So yeah, it was that kind of a response. It's just a coincidence. I gave them a vaccine for polio, and then they got polio. It's just a complete coincidence. It's fine. But it wasn't fine. That room full of researchers verbally tore Colmer a new one. There's a quote in the Polio in American History where I guess he said in front of them, like, "I just want the ground to swallow me up right now," which you should. Along with Colmer's reputation, the possibility of a polio vaccine was torn to shreds, at least for a while. But in 1948, another development brought us one step closer to a cure for polio. Or at least a vaccine for polio. There's no cure. You get it and you have to deal with it. Three researchers, John Enders, Thomas Weller, and Frederick Robbins, wanted to try and grow viruses in a different way. Let's just put the monkey spinal cords away, shall we? Again, another warning. This is the aborted fetuses part, so you want to skip ahead like 15, 30 seconds. Probably a good thing. Anyway, with the other two men assisting him, Enders used the flesh from an aborted fetus in a series of flasks treated with chickenpox, polio, and clean nutrient broth. 4 of them had chickenpox, 4 had polio, 4 had the clean broth. So that's the control group. They soon found that the fetal tissue in the polio flasks could grow the virus and pass it on to mice, even if it was diluted to the point of near non-existence. They went through trillions, quadrillions of filtering this thing down, and you could still get polio from what they had. So it was definitely in the viruses. They managed to transfer it without using monkeys. And that's how the 3 of them saved monkeys from ever having to give up their spinal cords or anything else for this again. The virus could now be grown in a lab in less necessary human cells, like foreskins from circumcisions. No, I'm not joking, and no, I don't want to know who's saving those. The 3 would later win the Nobel Prize for their work in 1954. In Jonas Salk's lab, he ended up using monkey testicles, which you don't have to kill the monkey to get, but I'm going to take a stab in the dark and say the monkeys aren't happy about it. Basil O'Connor and Jonas Salk clicked. To use a popular turn of phrase, Salk's crazy matched O'Connor's crazy. They were both eager and raring to go in terms of getting a polio vaccine done and fast. Now, I've been teasing Albert Sabin because he's just... I haven't been teasing him as much as I will. There's more teasing to come. But he was coming from an understandable place that science runs on its own timetable. You cannot force this kind of thing. And Sabin wasn't willing to just because he wanted to get done and wanted to be right. So while O'Connor started throwing a $200,000 yearly grant at Salk's labs from the March of Dimes, we're talking like $2.5 million in that time period worth of money. And that enabled him to hire 50 people. He's able to tell them exactly what he wants and what to do, all of that, and to try and get this polio vaccine done. Sabin was off working in his lab, presumably grumbling little insults about Salk's bona fides the entire time. He really is catty when it comes to Salk. Later on, after all of this is done, he was saying you could whip up what Salk came up with in the kitchen, which... then why didn't you? But anyway, so by the time Salk and Sabin dived into polio vaccine research in association with the March of Dimes, their 2 separate approaches made for a better chance of a working vaccine. Albert Sabin was focused on a polio vaccine that would have live but weakened viruses in it, which was usual when making vaccines at the time. Jonas Salk, on the other hand, would contain killed polio virus to prod the immune system into producing polio antibodies. And because it had no live virus, there was no risk in taking the vaccine that you might accidentally get polio in the process. Sabin wasn't in a rush. You could get his vaccine when you got his vaccine. No sooner, no later. If it took 10 years to do it his way, it took 10 years, and that was the end of that. Suffice it to say, Basil O'Connor didn't want to hear that. What he wanted to hear was that Jonas Salk told him, or what Jonas Salk told him. Kids were dying and they need to stop it. Almost as soon as Dr. Salk stuck his head in Basil O'Connor's office to ask about setting up human trials for his vaccine, like, he went through the whole process of doing this, and everything seemed to go great. Everything was going so well for Salk, and he came up with this vaccine. He goes in, he tells Basil O'Connor, and Basil O'Connor could have demanded more testing, but no, Basil O'Connor was rushing to organize these human trials. Like, let's go, let's do this. It didn't matter that Salk hadn't experienced any issues with his tests on monkeys, and the production of a vaccine had been relatively swift, and that Albert Sabin was probably outside the window waving his arms and yelling, "Don't do it! Don't do it!" Like, it was going so well, you're waiting for the other shoe to drop. Okay, now I'm going to say something that's going to sound really bad, and it's going to make Salk sound really bad, because it is kind of bad. Jonas Salk administered his killed virus polio vaccine to 43 children at the D.T. Watson Home for Crippled Children on July 2nd, 1952. Now I'm going to say something worse, so skip ahead 15 seconds to avoid what is now an ableist slur. The next place where Salk would test his vaccine would be at the Polk State School for the Retarded and Feeble-Minded. That was just a choice you made back then. I need people to be my guinea pigs, and those patients are right there, so I'll just use them. If it makes anybody feel better about his first choices on test subjects, by the way, he then gave it to himself and his wife and his 3 kids. So, there's that. You'll be happy to know no one got polio, though, so that's a good thing. Right about the time that this is happening, polio is spreading more than ever in the United States. In 1952, the nation faced over 57,000 cases of polio, with 3,100 deaths as a result, making it the worst polio epidemic in the history of the United States. Parents did not want to lose their kids to this disease. So, Basil O'Connor and Jonas Salk, they are doing these trials. They do another trial that is huge and includes like hundreds of thousands of kids in schools, giving them the virus. And then they had to wait and see and make sure that none of those kids got polio. And so in 1955, it's April of 1955, Basil O'Connor and Jonas Salk arrive at this room to give a press conference with their report about the vaccine and how the results came out and all of that. And when they come in, it is bedlam. They come in with like boxes of this report, and reporters are just like grabbing it and snatching it out of the box. But the news was good. They had a vaccine. It worked. And it was the sort of news that had people cheering in the streets. Everybody was so happy. We're finally going to get rid of COVID. We now have polio. We now have a fully tested and safe vaccine. Yay! And we're going to stop there. Because the next part is going to focus on the Cutter incident itself. And I still need to work on that part of the episode. But we're going to work on that. But I did want to get all of this established because this is all information you're going to need to know in regards to what happened with the Cutter incident and how that affected the way that people feel about vaccines now. Because it's still a problem. And so we're going to get into that. And I don't want to get too deep into what I'm going to talk about later, but I am going to say that, this is, a story about a mistake in medical history that cost people's lives. And as you can see with the trials that Jonas Salk did, there were a lot of choices made that were questionable or that had ethical concerns, or at least should have had ethical concerns, all of that. And medical history is filled with these. If we stopped using certain aspects of medicine because of bad things that had happened in the past in that aspect of medicine, we wouldn't get treated for anything anymore. Even natural homeopathic stuff, we wouldn't get treated for it anymore. Like, there would be nothing. We would just get sick and die. Like, that is the way things would be. Because as it stands, every part of medical history has a lot of bad things that have happened in its past. I mean, just speaking from my own experiences being neurodivergent, if you look at the history of treating mental illness and mental health, there are a lot of problems with that. I mean, I can't begin to describe, what would happen in mental institutes and mental asylums over the years. I can highly recommend the episodes The Dollop on Nellie Bly, because there is a point where she is where she kind of admits herself to an asylum, and then she spends like 10 days in there, if I'm remembering correctly, and somebody has to come get her out because she cannot get out. They're like, no, you're crazy. And it's like, no. Yeah, and he was a huge problem. And the things that they used to send you to an asylum for, like the reasons that have been written down for why women, a lot of women in particular, were sent to mental health facilities or were given lobotomies in the mid 19th century, 20th century, excuse me, like Rosemary Kennedy, the aunt of our current Secretary of Health and Human Services, was given a lobotomy because of quote unquote misbehavior. And after that, she basically had the mental acuity of a 2-year-old. And that's horrible. I mean, there were people who got a lobotomy who did better afterwards, but a lot of people did not. A lot of people did not survive getting one. And there's a reason that was a really bad decision on the part of the Kennedy family to do something like that to Rosemary, and a bad decision for so many other families who heard about this great thing that was supposed to solve all sorts of problems, and it was for things like being a little rebellious, acting different, being a lesbian. Like these are the sorts of things that they would go, okay, well, we'll just take an ice pick and hammer it into your eye socket near, into your brain, and that will just fix everything. Like, no. But a lot of different parts of medical history are like this. If you really want to be thoroughly upset, look into the history of gynecology, and the person who is called the father of gynecology, not a good person. Not even a little bit. I believe that is also in Medical Apart title. I still have to, I have to go back and reread it. I haven't read it in a while. So, but yeah, that it's bad. It's bad. So much of our medical history is just bad choices all around. And this may be, it's not so much as I mean, this has some ethical stuff going on that is really bad. But the next episode, you're going to see some stuff that is appalling. So there you go. I'm going to try and get that episode done in a couple of days. I just want to add a couple more things. I really wish I would have been able to hurry because I am so broke right now. But I'm trying, man. I'm trying. Things are hard and the world is difficult. My tummy aches and I hate the government. So there you go. I will see you in the next episode. It's part 2 of the Cutter incident. And until then, stay safe.